Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a kitchen that smells like coffee and dish soap, and something sweet just coming out of the oven. Back to a house where the radio is humming in the background, and the morning light is coming in through curtains that were washed and ironed and hung back up before most people even thought about their day. Back to a life that looks quiet from the outside, but underneath never stopped moving. Before we begin, I want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You sent it in with such thoughtfulness, and it stuck with me. That is exactly the kind of message that shapes what this channel becomes. So truly, thank you. If you are enjoying what we do here, a like and a subscribe mean more than you know. They help this little corner of the internet keep going. And if you have a topic you would love to see explored, drop it in the comments. Some of the best videos on this channel started exactly that way. We're also now on Spotify, so if you prefer to listen while you fall asleep or go for a walk, you can find the link in the description. Now, dim the lights, put on a fan if you have one nearby, settle in somewhere comfortable, a chair, a couch, your bed, wherever the day lets you rest. Because tonight, we are not rushing anywhere. Have you ever wondered what a Tuesday morning in 1954 actually felt like inside an American home? Not the magazine version, not the television version, but the real one. The one where the alarm went off before 6 and the work had already begun before anyone else in the house had opened their eyes. What did it feel like to run an entire household without a single appliance doing the thinking for you? What did a Monday look like when laundry meant filling a tub, wringing fabric by hand, and carrying wet sheets out to a line in the cold? What did a woman carry with her quietly, day after day, in a life that the world called simple? And just like that, it is 1953. The coffee is already percolating on the stove. Somewhere down the street, a screen door bangs shut. The house is not yet awake, but you are. You have been for a while, and the day, long and full and entirely yours to manage, is just beginning. The alarm does not ring for everyone at the same time in a 1950s household. It rings for you first. Long before the children need to be dressed and fed, long before your husband reaches for his tie, you're already downstairs, moving through the kitchen in the thin grey light of early morning, striking a match to light the burner and setting the percolator on the flame. This is the hour that belongs to no one else, quiet and unhurried and yours, except that it is never truly quiet because your mind is already running the list for the day ahead. The kitchen is cold at this hour, the linoleum is cool under your feet, and the windows have that faint haze of condensation that tells you the night was damp. You pull your housecoat a little tighter and move to the window for a moment, looking out at the yard. The grass is still dark, the neighbour's house is still dark, the whole street is still dark, and there is something in that. Something that belongs only to the people who are awake before the rest of the world has decided to be. You do not stand there long. There is too much to do, and doing it quietly without waking anyone is its own particular skill. You have learned to move through this kitchen the way a person moves through a room where someone is sleeping. You know which drawer sticks and rattles if you pull it too fast. You know that the cabinet above the stove creaks if you open it past a certain angle. You know where the floorboard gives under your weight and you step around it without thinking. The way you step around everything in this house that might disturb the peace you are holding together. The percolator begins its slow build, a soft gurgling that fills the kitchen with the sound and smell of something warming. Coffee in the morning is not a luxury in this house. It is a foundation. It is the thing that signals to your body that the day has a shape now, that the formless dark of early morning is organizing itself into something with purpose. While the coffee percolates, you begin the first small tasks, You check the bread box to see if there is enough for toast. You take the eggs from the refrigerator and set them on the counter to lose their chill before they go in the pan. You think about what the children will need for their lunches and whether the cold cuts are holding or whether you need to make something from what is left in the pantry. These are not decisions you make slowly. They're a kind of mental arithmetic that runs in the background of everything else, fast and practiced and invisible to anyone who might walk in and see you simply standing at the counter. Nobody walks in yet. It is too early for that. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in this hour that is hard to explain to someone who has not lived it. The house is yours in a way it will not be once everyone wakes up. The quiet belongs to you. The warmth gathering in the kitchen belongs to you. You are not yet anyone's mother or anyone's wife in the active, tending sense of those words. You're just a person in a warm kitchen, watching the light come up through the window, doing the first of the day's work before the day has officially started. By the time the coffee is ready, the sky outside has shifted from black to a deep, uncertain blue. A bird has started somewhere in the yard. The furnace kicks on with a low thud, and you hear the heat begin to move through the house, through the registers in the floors and the walls, warming the rooms where everyone is still sleeping. You pour your coffee into a cup and take the first sip standing at the counter, not sitting, because sitting down this early somehow makes it harder to keep moving, and you have learned that about yourself too. The cup is warm in both hands, the coffee is strong. Outside, the blue is beginning to lighten at the edges. This is the moment, small and unremarkable and completely your own, before the day claims you entirely, before the first voice calls from upstairs, before the front door opens and closes, before the house fills up with all of its noise and need and love and motion. In a few minutes you will crack the eggs. You will call the children. You will begin the long work of the day in earnest, and it will not stop until long after dinner, long after the kitchen is clean again, long after the house has gone quiet the way it is quiet right now. But for just this moment, you are here. The coffee is hot, the light is coming, and the day, with everything it is about to ask of you, has not quite begun. Breakfast in a 1950s home was not a bowl of cereal poured in 30 seconds. It was eggs cracked fresh into an iron skillet, bacon laid out in careful strips, toast made under a broiler that required watching, orange juice squeezed by hand into a glass pitcher, and hot oatmeal stirred slowly on the back burner so it would not scorch. By the time everyone sat down at the table, you'd already been cooking for the better part of an hour, and the kitchen was warm with the kind of heat that settles into your clothes and stays with you all morning. The bacon goes in first because it takes the longest, and because the fat it releases is what everything else will cook in. You lay the strips out one by one in the cold iron skillet and turn the burner up slowly. The kitchen fills with the sound of it almost immediately, a low sizzle that builds as the pan heats, and then the smell, that particular smell of bacon on a weekday morning, that even now, decades later, is enough to bring a whole era back in a single breath. You crack the eggs into a bowl and beat them with a fork while the bacon begins to curl at the edges. The oatmeal is already on the back burner, thickening slowly, and you stir it every few minutes so it does not catch on the bottom. The toast will go under the broiler last, because toast waits for no one and must be watched or it will burn, and burned toast on a school morning is the kind of small catastrophe that can unsettle the whole room. The children come down in stages, the youngest first, still soft-faced and slow, needing help with buttons. The older ones noisier, looking for things they left somewhere the night before. Your husband comes last, already in his work shirt, his tie not yet knotted. He pours his coffee and stands at the counter reading yesterday's paper the way he does every morning. and you move around him without thinking about it. The two of you sharing the kitchen the way people share a space they know well, without having to negotiate it. The table has been set since last night. Plates, glasses, napkins folded flat. You transfer the eggs to a serving dish, and the bacon to a plate lined with a folded paper towel to catch the grease. The oatmeal goes into the pot on a trivet in the centre of the table. The toast comes out from under the broiler golden just barely, and you butter it quickly before it loses its heat. Then you call everyone to the table, and the room, which a moment ago was just noise and motion, assembles itself into something that looks, for a few minutes, like a picture. Everyone in their places, everyone fed, the morning routine doing what it was designed to do. What the picture does not show is the hour you spent making it happen, the planning the night before, the early rising, the careful management of 4 things cooking at once on a stove that had no timer, no sensor, nothing but your own attention to keep it all from going wrong. That part of the morning belongs to the part of the day that no one sees and no one names. You sit down last. You eat quickly because there are dishes to clear before the children leave for school, and the kitchen does not clean itself, and the day, which has barely begun, is already moving faster than you are. 3. Washing dishes before the day had hardly begun. There were no shortcuts once the plates were cleared. You stacked them beside the sink, ran the hot water until steam rose off the basin, and began the slow work of washing every cup, every glass, every pan that had been used since the night before. In many homes, a dishwasher was still a luxury too expensive to consider, and so the dishes were done by hand, dried by hand, and put away in the same cabinet they had come from, every single morning, before the rest of the day had really started. The water has to be hot enough to cut the grease, but not so scalding that you cannot keep your hands in it for more than a few seconds, and you find the temperature by feel, the way you find most things in this kitchen, through long practice and small adjustments. You add the dish soap and work up a lather and begin with the glasses first, because that is the right order. Glasses before plates, plates before pots. Pots always last because they take the most work, and there is no point in dirtying already clean water with the worst of it before the rest is done. The radio is on. It usually is at this hour, low enough not to wake anyone who might still be sleeping, loud enough to keep the room from feeling entirely silent. A voice reads the news or a song plays that you half recognize, and the sound of it is a kind of company, not intrusive, just present, the way the sound of traffic might be company to someone living near a road they've grown accustomed to. The breakfast dishes take longer than they should because this morning there was oatmeal, and oatmeal sets in the pot like something determined to stay. You fill the pot with hot water and leave it to soak while you finish the rest, and when you come back to it, the residue has softened enough to scrub free with a little effort. You rinse it under running water and dry it and hang it back on the hook beside the stove where it lives. By the time the dish rack is full and draining and you have begun to dry and put away, the children have gone. The house has shifted register. The noise of the morning rush has withdrawn like a tide, and what is left is a particular quiet that belongs to the middle of the week. A productive, slightly hollow quiet that will stay with you through most of the day. You wring out the dishcloth and drape it over the faucet to dry. You wipe down the counters. You wipe down the stovetop where the bacon spattered. You check the percolator and pour the last cup of coffee before it turns bitter, and you stand at the counter and drink it while it is still warm enough to be worth drinking. The kitchen is clean. It will not stay clean because kitchens never do, but for this moment it is in order, and there is a satisfaction in that which is genuine and quiet and yours. You have done the first real work of the day, and the day is not yet 9 o'clock. You rinse your cup, you dry it, You put it away, and then you begin the next thing. There was a rhythm to the week in a 1950s household, and it was not flexible. Monday belonged to laundry, and laundry in that era was not a matter of loading a machine and walking away. It was a full physical undertaking that began before breakfast was finished and often didn't end until late afternoon. Water had to be heated, the wringer washer had to be loaded and watched. Each piece had to be fed through the rollers by hand, and the wrung-out clothes had to be carried outside and hung on the line before the morning lost its dry air. You sorted the laundry the night before, separating whites from colours, lights from darks, the things that needed gentle handling from the things that could be fed through the wringer without thought. The sorting itself takes longer than most people imagine, because a household produces more laundry than it seems like it should. Shirts, trousers, dresses, underthings, sheets, pillowcases, dish towels, hand towels, the children's play clothes, which are in a category of their own for what they have encountered during the week. It all adds up, and all of it needs attention, and none of it is going to manage itself. The wringer washer stands in the utility room or on the back porch or in the basement, depending on what kind of house you live in, and you have made a kind of peace with it, the way you make peace with anything you rely on heavily. You know its sounds. You know when it is running well and when something's about to go wrong. You know not to put too much in at once, and you know that the rollers will catch fabric in unexpected ways if you're not paying close enough attention. The washing takes most of the morning. One load finishes and you pull the wet clothes out and feed them through the wringer, turning the crank or working the foot pedal depending on your machine, and the water runs out in a flat stream into the collection tub while the fabric comes out the other side compressed and dripping and heavy. You carry it outside in the basket and begin pinning it to the line, working from one end to the other, smoothing each piece before you pin it so it will dry without too many wrinkles, because wrinkles mean ironing, and ironing on top of laundry day is something you would rather avoid. The line fills up, sheets billow in the morning air, shirts hang with their arms slightly extended, moving in the breeze like something about to say something. There is a satisfaction in a full clothesline that is hard to articulate, something about the evidence of work made visible, the household's interior life hung out in the open air to dry. By early afternoon the first load is ready to take down, stiff and sun-warm and smelling of nothing complicated, just air and light and clean cotton. You fold as you go, pressing the creases in with your hands before they set, stacking everything in the basket. The next load goes out. The afternoon moves forward in this way, load following load, the line filling and emptying and filling again. By the time your husband comes home, the laundry is done, put away or stacked neatly, or waiting for tomorrow's ironing. The evidence of the day's work has been absorbed back into the house, invisible again, which is exactly how it is supposed to look. Tuesday in many homes meant ironing, and ironing meant hours standing at the board with a heavy iron that had to be kept at exactly the right temperature, or it would scorch the fabric it touched. Shirts, trousers, dresses, pillowcases, tablecloths, even your husband's handkerchiefs. All of it passed under that iron, one piece at a time, until the basket was empty and the closet was full again. There was a particular kind of quiet that settled over the room while you worked. The soft hiss of steam, the rhythmic press and lift, the smell of warm cotton, and outside the window, the ordinary afternoon going on without you. The ironing board is set up in the living room or the bedroom or wherever there is enough space to move around it without catching the cord on something. You fill the water reservoir of the steam iron and let it heat up while you pull the first piece from the basket, one of your husband's work shirts, because shirts require the most attention, and it is better to do them while your concentration is still fresh. You start with the collar, pressing it flat on both sides, then move to the cuffs, then the sleeves, then the back panel, then the front. This is not a sequence you have to think about. It is the order you learned and have always followed. The same way you follow a recipe you have made so many times the steps live in your hands rather than your head. Each section takes a certain number of passes. You know when the fabric is done by the way it looks and the way it lies flat against the board. The steam hisses up in small bursts when you press the button on the handle, and the smell of it, hot water and clean cotton, fills the room in a way that is not unpleasant, just ordinary. The smell of Tuesday afternoon. There are 15 shirts in the basket. There are dresses for the girls, which take longer because of the gathered skirts and the delicate collars. There are your husband's trousers, which require a crease pressed down each leg so sharp it could hold its own in an argument. There are the pillowcases from Monday's wash, which do not strictly need ironing, but which look so much better ironed that you do them anyway, because standards in this house are your standards, and your standards are what keep things from quietly falling apart. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon the radio is company, a soap opera, a music program, something to fill the room while your hands keep moving. The iron goes back and forth, and the basket empties slowly, and the pile of finished things grows on the chair beside you, neat and smooth, ready to be hung or folded and put away. By the time you finish, your feet ache from standing, and your back has that low, dull fatigue that comes from hours of leaning forward at just the wrong angle. You unplug the iron and let it cool and put the board away and carry the finished clothes to the closet and the drawers where they belong. Tomorrow they will be worn and wrinkled again. Next Tuesday, you will iron them again. This is not frustrating. It is simply the shape of the work, and the shape of the work is the shape of the week, and the week is what keeps the household running, and the household running is what you are here to do. For many 1950s housewives, the grocery store was a walk away, or a bus ride, or a careful coordination of schedules around the one car the family shared. You went with a list written the night before, a list that accounted for the week ahead down to the last can of soup because there was no running back to the store on a whim. You knew what was on sale. You knew which cuts of meat were within the week's budget. You carried the bags home yourself, and if the children were small enough, you carried them too. The list is a document with a logic to it that only you fully understand. It is organized by the layout of the store, produce first, then canned goods, then the butcher counter at the back, then dairy along the far wall. You have shopped this store enough times that you move through it like you move through your own kitchen without having to think about where anything is. The thinking was done at the kitchen table last night, when you went through what was in the pantry and what was running low and what would be needed for the meals you'd already planned in your head through Saturday. The butcher knows you by name. So does the woman at the register. There is a social dimension to grocery shopping in this era that has mostly vanished from the modern version. A few minutes of conversation at the meat counter, a comment about the weather from the woman ahead of you in line, a brief exchange about the week's specials that sometimes yields information worth having. The grocery store is not just a place to buy things. It is part of the neighbourhood's small daily fabric. You're careful at the butcher counter. You know that a chuck roast will feed the family twice if you plan it right. Once as a pot roast on Sunday, and again as something else on Monday with the leftovers and a little creativity. You know that ground beef stretches further in a meatloaf than it does in hamburgers. You know the difference between the cuts that are tender enough to cook quickly and the ones that need hours of slow heat to become what you want them to be. This is not knowledge that came from a book. It came from years of feeding people on a budget that did not have much room for mistakes. The bags are heavy on the walk home. You carry them two-handed, shifting the weight from side to side on the longer stretches, and if the children are with you, they carry what they can, which is not much but is something. By the time you get home, your arms have that particular ache that comes from carrying something heavier than comfortable for longer than ideal, and you set the bags on the kitchen counter and stand still for a moment before you begin putting everything away. The pantry fills up. The refrigerator fills up. The week ahead takes shape in the cans and packages and wrapped parcels arranged on their shelves, and there is in that a quiet reassurance, the knowledge that the family is provided for, that the planning worked, that the week has what it needs. You fold the paper bags and slide them into the drawer where they live for reuse. Nothing gets thrown away that does not have to be. There was no waste in a well-run 1950s kitchen, not if you were doing things properly. The chicken roasted on Sunday became the broth on Monday. The leftover vegetables went into Tuesday's soup. Bread that had gone slightly stale was sliced. Clean windows changed the light inside a room in a way that was almost architectural, and you noticed it every time. The way the rooms opened up when the glass was clear, the way the yard looked closer and more vivid, the way the whole house seemed to take a breath. The rugs came outside on a dry afternoon. You draped them over the porch railing or the clothesline and beat them with a wire rug beater that had been your mother's, and the dust came out in billows that caught the light and drifted sideways in whatever breeze there was. It was hard work, rhythmic and loud, and when you brought the rugs back inside and laid them down again, the colours were brighter, or seemed to be, the way things seem after they have been properly attended to. The house does not thank you for this. It simply reflects it back, in the way a clean room feels different from a neglected one, calmer, more ordered, more like a place where a family can actually live rather than a place where entropy is quietly winning. That difference is what you're maintaining every day with your hands and your back and the time you spend on it, and tomorrow it will need doing again. The children needed feeding, dressing, bathing, watching, correcting, encouraging, and putting to bed, and all of that happened in the margins of everything else. There was no dropping them at a daycare, no handing a tablet to a toddler for 20 minutes of peace. If a child was sick, you were the nurse. If a child was struggling in school, you sat at the kitchen table in the evening and worked through it with them. The children were not a part of the day. They were woven into every hour of it, and pulling them out to find your own time was something you learned not to expect. The morning begins with them before it begins with anything else. The youngest needs to be lifted from the crib and changed and dressed while you're still in your housecoat, still moving on the slow momentum of the first cup of coffee. The older ones need reminding to wash their face, reminding to make the bed, reminding that the lunchbox is on the counter, and the permission slip for school is on the table, and shoes are not optional. You say these things without irritation because irritation takes more energy than the morning has to offer, and because the children are not being difficult, they are simply being children, which is a full-time occupation in itself. When one of them is sick, the day reorganizes itself around the illness. You take their temperature with a glass thermometer that has to be read in the light from the window. You make broth and bring it to them in bed on a tray. You check in every hour, pressing a hand to their forehead, reading the colour in their face the way experienced mothers learn to read it, an index of symptoms written in the body's own language. You do not call the doctor unless you are certain it warrants it, because doctor visits cost money, and because you have become, over time, a reasonably reliable diagnostician of childhood ailments. The well children still need managing while the sick one rests. They need to be kept quiet enough not to disturb their sibling, and occupied enough not to disturb you. You set them up with something at the kitchen table and check on them between tasks. A presence that is not quite supervision, and not quite inattention, but something in between. The kind of watchfulness that runs beneath the surface of everything else you are doing. In the evenings, the homework comes out and the kitchen table becomes a schoolroom. You sit with the one who is struggling with long division and work through it again from the beginning. Patiently, because the patience is required regardless of how tired you are. You help the older one with a book report, asking questions that help them find the shape of what they want to say. You do not do it for them. You do what your mother did for you, sit beside them and hold the space while they figure it out. Bedtime has a ritual, and the ritual must be followed or the children will not settle. Bath, pyjamas, teeth, the glass of water that is always requested and always granted, the book read in the lamplight beside the bed, the tuck-in and the good night, and the door left open at exactly the angle that lets in enough light from the hallway to keep the dark from feeling too complete. Then you go back downstairs to finish what the evening still requires of you. Lunch was not leftovers grabbed from the refrigerator and eaten standing at the counter. It was a meal prepared and set on the table, because the children came home from school at noon in many neighborhoods, and your husband might come home too if work was nearby. Then dinner was a longer undertaking still, something planned since morning, something that required the oven or the stovetop or both, something that arrived at the table hot and complete every single evening regardless of how the rest of the day had gone. Lunch arrives quickly and must leave quickly. The children have 45 minutes before they need to be back, and your husband has not much more than that if he's come home at all. You make something that does not require the full production of breakfast or dinner, soup heated from the pot on the back of the stove, a sandwich built from what is in the refrigerator, a plate of sliced things with crackers and a glass of cold milk. Simple does not mean careless. The plate is set properly. The napkins are there. The meal looks like a meal and not like something thrown together, because even the simple things in this house are done with attention. The children eat and go. The kitchen is wiped down again, the third time today, and it is only afternoon. Dinner has been in the back of your mind since breakfast. You knew when you got up this morning what tonight would be, because dinner does not decide itself at 5 o'clock. It decides itself the night before, or earlier in the week when you planned around what the butcher had, and what was left in the pantry, and what the family had already eaten earlier in the week and needed a break from. Tonight it is a pot roast, which has been in the oven since 2, low and slow, filling the house by mid-afternoon with a smell so deeply domestic and so specifically that era that it is almost impossible to separate the smell from the feeling of the time itself. By 5 o'clock the potatoes are peeled and in the pot. The carrots are sliced and have been added to the roasting pan. The kitchen is warm and fragrant and beginning to produce that particular late afternoon atmosphere that belongs to the hour before dinner, busy and purposeful and full of anticipation. You taste things as you go. You adjust the seasoning. You add a little more water to the pan so the drippings do not catch. You make the gravy from what is in the bottom of the roasting pan, whisking flour into the fat over medium heat, watching it thicken, adding the broth slowly until the consistency is right. The table is set. The children have been called and have washed their hands. Your husband is in from the yard or back from work, depending on the evening, and the house is at its fullest and its warmest and its loudest for this 1 hour. You bring the food to the table and everyone sits. This is the third meal you have made today. Tomorrow there will be 3 more. And the evening after that, and the one after that, for as many years as the family is under this roof, and you are the one keeping it running. The table will be set and the food will be hot, and the family will eat, not because it happens by itself, but because you made it happen 3 times a day, every day, without making it look like the considerable work it was. The smell of something baking was not an event in a 1950s home. It was a background condition, as ordinary as the radio playing in the next room. Bread was baked at home because it was cheaper, because it was better, and because a woman who did not bake was thought to be cutting corners on her household. Pies came out of the oven for Sunday dinner and for company, and sometimes just for a Wednesday, because the apples needed using and the crust could be made in 20 minutes if you knew what you were doing. The bread begins the night before, or early in the morning before the rest of the house is awake. You proof the yeast in warm water and watch for the moment it begins to foam, that small living signal that everything is working the way it should. Then the flour goes in, cup by cup, and the dough comes together under your hands on the floured board. Tacky at first and then smoother, more cooperative, more like something with a future. You knead it for 10 minutes, pushing the heel of your hand into it as folding it back, turning it a quarter turn, pushing again, a rhythm that is almost meditative once you find it. The dough rests covered with a clean dish towel in a warm corner of the kitchen. You move on to other things. An hour later you come back to it and it has risen, almost doubled, and you punch it down with one satisfying press of your fist and shape it into loaves and set it to rise again in the greased pans. The second rise is shorter. By the time it goes into the oven, the kitchen already smells of yeast and warmth and something about to become itself. Fresh bread out of the oven is one of those things that requires no improvement and no explanation. You set the loaves on the rack to cool and the smell moves through the house like an announcement. The children find their way to the kitchen. Your husband appears in the doorway. Everyone wants the first slice and everyone knows the first slice goes to whoever is cutting it, which is you, and you cut it thick and spread it with butter, while it is still warm enough to melt the butter on contact. And for that one moment the kitchen holds the kind of contentment that does not require anything further. The pies follow their own calendar. Apple in the fall, when the fruit is fresh and cheap, and the season calls for it. Peach in the summer, the juice running out under the lattice crust and caramelizing on the pan. Pumpkin in November. Cherry for the 4th of July if you can get the cherries pitted in time. Lemon meringue for company, because lemon meringue looks impressive enough to signal that the visit matters, even though you have made it so many times it no longer presents any real difficulty. The crust is the thing most people fear, and you have long since stopped fearing it. Cold butter, cold water, a light hand, and the willingness to stop working it before you think you are finished. Overworked crust is tough. Properly made crust shatters when you press a fork through it, and that is exactly what you are after. That particular give that means the fat and the flour did what they were supposed to do. You bake because it is necessary, and because you are good at it, and because there is a satisfaction in pulling something finished and golden out of an oven that almost nothing else in the day quite matches. The house smells like a home when something is baking. That is not a small thing. That smell means safety and abundance and someone taking care, and you have known since you were a child in your own mother's kitchen that the smell of baking is one of the ways a house tells the people inside it that they are looked after. You will bake again on Friday, and next week, and the week after that. The oven is never cold for long. Nothing in a 1950s household was thrown away because it had a hole in it. You sat with a needle and thread and you mended it. A torn hem was repaired the same evening it tore. Socks were darned over a wooden egg. Buttons were replaced. Children's clothing was let out at the seams as they grew. then handed down when it could not be let out any further. And if a new dress was needed, you might very well make it yourself, cutting the pattern pieces out on the kitchen floor and running the fabric through the sewing machine on a Saturday afternoon. The sewing basket lives beside your chair in the living room because that is where the evening hours are spent, and the evening hours are when the mending gets done. After dinner, after the dishes, after the children are in bed, you sit in the lamplight and work through whatever the basket holds. Tonight, it is a pair of your son's trousers with a tear at the knee, a blouse with a button missing from the third buttonhole, and a pillowcase whose seam has started to give along one edge. None of it is urgent. All of it needs doing. You thread the needle without a second thought, holding the thread end between your lips to stiffen it slightly before guiding it through the eye, the way your mother taught you and her mother taught her. The lamp is angled to throw the light where you need it. Your husband is in his chair reading the paper. The radio is on softly. The room has the particular quiet of a weeknight evening, settled and unhurried, and the work in your hands is the kind that requires just enough attention to keep the mind pleasantly occupied without demanding all of it. The darn on the sock is a small architecture. You run the thread in parallel rows across the hole and then weave perpendicular rows through them, building a new fabric from nothing, restoring the sock to something close to its original usefulness. It will not be invisible. It never is. But it will hold, and holding is what matters, and a sock that holds is a sock that does not need replacing, and not replacing things is how the household budget stays in balance week after week. The sewing machine comes out for the larger projects. A new dress for your daughter takes a Saturday afternoon from pattern to finished hem, the machine running in steady bursts while the fabric moves under the presser foot and the seams come together. You have made enough of these that the construction no longer requires consulting the pattern instructions. You know which pieces join which seams need clipping at the curves, how much ease to add at the shoulders so the child can move freely. The fabric cost you less than a dress from the store would have, and the fit is better, and the dress will last longer, because you chose the fabric yourself, and you know how it behaves in the wash. There is a generation of women in this era for whom sewing is not a hobby. It is a household skill as fundamental as cooking, practiced out of necessity and refined over years into something that looks, from the outside, almost effortless. The curtains in your living room were made on your machine. So were the slip covers on the chairs. So was the apron you wear every morning, cut from a remnant of cotton you bought at the fabric counter for almost nothing. You do not think of yourself as someone who sews. You think of yourself as someone who takes care of things, and sewing is one of the ways that taking care looks. Monday was laundry, Tuesday was ironing, Wednesday was for deep cleaning, Thursday was marketing, Friday was for baking, Saturday was for whatever had not been finished during the week. Sunday was church, and then dinner, and then the quiet that meant tomorrow it all began again. This rhythm was not written down anywhere. It lived in the body, in the muscle memory of a woman who had been managing a household long enough that the days organized themselves around her work rather than the other way around. Other women in the neighborhood kept the same schedule, or close to it, and you could track the week by what you saw through the kitchen window and across the back fence. Monday mornings, the clotheslines filled up and down the block. Wednesday, the sound of vacuums ran through the open windows of houses up and down the street. Thursday, the women with shopping bags moved toward the bus stop or the corner market, with a purposeful walk of people who have a list and intend to honour it. There was a collective rhythm to the neighbourhood that followed the rhythm inside your own house, and knowing that others were doing the same things at the same times made the work feel less like an individual burden and more like a shared understanding about how things were done. The schedule existed because without it the household would drift. Laundry left until it was convenient would pile up until it was unmanageable. Cleaning deferred would compound until a single afternoon could not address it. Baking delayed meant the family ate bread that was too old or, worse, bought bread from the store, which cost more and tasted like a compromise. The schedule was not a constraint. It was a structure, and the structure was what kept the days from consuming one another. Flexibility existed, but quietly. If a child was sick on Wednesday, the deep clean moved to Thursday, and the marketing shifted to Friday, and everything compressed slightly to accommodate the disruption, then straightened itself back out by the following week. You did not announce these adjustments. You simply made them, the way a person navigates a familiar room in the dark, knowing where the furniture is without needing to see it. Sunday occupied a different register entirely. Church in the morning meant the household was dressed and out the door with a precision the weekdays rarely required. Everyone presentable, everyone punctual, because the community would see you, and the community's seeing of you was part of what Sunday meant. The drive home afterward had a particular quality, quiet and slightly formal, the week's ordinary noise not yet resumed. Then Sunday dinner, which was the meal the week built toward. The roast or the chicken, the good dishes, the tablecloth that did not come out on weekdays. The family around the table in a way that felt different from the Tuesday or Thursday version of the same scene, more deliberate, more aware of itself as a gathering. By Sunday evening, the week ahead was already organizing itself in your mind. The list was forming. The schedule was resetting. Tomorrow was Monday, and Monday was laundry, and the rhythm that held the household together was already beginning again before the current week had fully closed. When company was coming for dinner, there was no calling a restaurant, no ordering in, no stopping at a bakery on the way home. You planned a menu that could be mostly prepared in advance. You cleaned the house from top to bottom the day before. You set the table with the good dishes that came out only for guests. And you spent the afternoon cooking a meal that would take most of the evening to eat and most of the next morning to clean up after. Hospitality in the 1950s was a labour of both love and considerable effort, and a woman who could do it gracefully was considered to have mastered something worth mastering. The invitation goes out a week in advance, or two if the occasion is formal enough to warrant it. From the moment the date is settled, the planning begins. You choose a menu that can be largely managed before the guests arrive, because a hostess disappearing into the kitchen every 10 minutes is not a hostess. She is a cook, and the role requires you to be both, which means preparing as much as possible in the hours before anyone knocks on the door. The roast goes in mid-afternoon. The salad is made and covered and waiting in the refrigerator. The dessert, a jello mold or a layer cake or a pie depending on the season, was finished the day before. The house cleaning happens in stages. A full deep clean the day before company, baseboards and windows and the bathroom polished to a standard it does not typically meet on ordinary weeks. The day of, a quick pass through every visible room, tucking away anything that reads as too lived in, plumping the cushions, checking the surfaces for dust that may have settled overnight. You want the house to look effortless, which means ensuring the effort does not show, which is its own considerable project. The good dishes come down from the shelf where they wait between occasions, 12 place settings of china that were a wedding gift and are treated accordingly. You wash them by hand even though they have not been used since the last time you had company, because sitting unused gathers a particular kind of film that only hot water and attention will remove. They are dried and set with care, the pattern facing the same direction at each place, the silverware arranged with the precision of a room that is expecting to be judged. When the guests arrive, you are already in your good dress, the house smelling of whatever is in the oven, the table set and waiting, the living room composed. You answer the door with a composure that took most of the day to construct and reveal none of the construction. You take coats, offer drinks, steer conversation with the ease of someone who's been rehearsing the evening in their head since Tuesday. Dinner is served and it is good because you made it good, through planning and attention and the accumulated knowledge of years of feeding people well. The guests compliment the food and you accept the compliment with the modest grace the era expects, something along the lines of, "Oh, it was nothing," even though it was not nothing. It was the better part of 2 days, and both of you know it, and the knowing is enough. The household budget was not a vague concept in most 1950s homes. It was a ledger, a careful accounting kept in a small notebook or a worn envelope, tracked every week by the woman who knew exactly how much came in and exactly how much had to stretch. She paid the bills by mail, wrote out the checks or the money orders, kept track of what had been paid and what was still due, and made the quiet adjustments that kept the family afloat in the lean weeks, all without making it feel like a crisis to the people around her. The envelope system was common. Cash divided at the beginning of the week into categories: groceries, utilities, household needs, a small amount set aside for the unexpected, because the unexpected always arrived, and a household with no provision for it was a household in permanent low-level crisis. You moved money between the envelopes when the week required it, taking a little from one category to cover a shortfall in another, and you kept track of those adjustments the way you kept track of everything in this house, in your head, with a precision that never announced itself. The bills arrived by mail and were paid by mail. You sat at the kitchen table on the same morning each week and worked through the stack, writing the check or the money order, addressing the envelope, adding the stamp. The checkbook was balanced by hand, subtraction by subtraction, and if the numbers did not agree, you went back through the entries until you found where the discrepancy was, which sometimes took longer than the bill paying itself. You did not move on until the balance was right, because a checkbook that did not balance was a household that was not under control, and this household was always under control. The larger financial decisions moved through you as well, though they were rarely framed that way. When the car needed a repair, you knew before anyone else whether the repair was affordable that month or whether something else would have to wait. When the children needed new shoes, you knew which child's need was most urgent and which could hold another few weeks. You knew the exact cost of the week's groceries before you reached the register, because you had added them in your head as you moved through the store, and you were almost never wrong. There was no one to consult about this. No financial advisor, no budgeting application, no automated alert when a balance ran low. There was only the notebook, the envelopes, your own arithmetic, and the quiet understanding that if you managed it well, the family would not feel the difficulty, and if you managed it poorly, they would, and you had no intention of managing it poorly. The satisfaction of a week where the numbers worked, where the groceries were bought and the bills were paid and the little emergency fund had not been touched, was a satisfaction that no one else in the house would ever fully understand or think to name. But you knew, and the knowing was enough. In the romanticized memory of the era, there was always a neighbor nearby, a grandmother down the street, a whole community looking in on one another, and sometimes that was true. But often a 1950s housewife was raising children in a suburb far from her own mother, in a neighborhood of houses whose residents she had only recently met. managing the day-to-day demands of young children largely on her own. The loneliness of that particular arrangement was real, and it rarely appeared in the magazine photographs of cheerful women in bright kitchens. The suburbs grew fast in the years after the war. Developments appeared on the edges of cities where farmland had been, streets of nearly identical houses filled with families who had come from somewhere else, uprooted from the neighbourhoods and the relatives and the familiar rhythms that might have supported them. Your nearest family might be an afternoon's drive away. You spoke to your mother on the telephone once a week, a call you looked forward to and rationed because long-distance calls cost money, and what you said into the receiver was a carefully edited version of the week that left out the harder parts because what would be the point of worrying her? You made do with what was near. The neighbour 2 doors down had children close to your children's ages, and you developed a friendship built on proximity and mutual need. A friendship that consisted largely of watching each other's children for an hour here and there, of borrowing an egg when the recipe called for more than you had, of standing at the back fence on a Tuesday afternoon talking about nothing in particular because talking to another adult about nothing in particular was a need that did not disappear simply because the life you were living did not make much room for it. The loneliness was not the dramatic kind. It did not announce itself. It was more like a background condition, a low persistent awareness that the day would pass without any adult conversation of substance, that the work you were doing was invisible to everyone outside the house and largely unremarked upon by everyone inside it, that the person you had been before the children arrived, the one with opinions and interests and time to pursue them, was still there somewhere, quieter now, a little harder to locate. You did not have a language for this in the 1950s. The culture around you said that this life was what women were made for, and perhaps some women found it to be exactly that. But others moved through the days with a faint, unnamed restlessness, a sense that something was asking to be expressed and had not yet found its way out. You loved your children. That was never the question. The question was more subtle, more difficult, more quietly present in the hours between the morning rush and the evening meal, when the house was as clean as it was going to get, and the dinner was already started, and there was a particular stillness in the kitchen that felt like it was waiting for something you could not quite name. Someone had to hold the mood of the household. Someone had to notice when the children were anxious about something at school. Someone had to sense when tension was building and quietly redirect it before it became a problem. Someone had to absorb the frustration that came in through the front door each evening and find a way to smooth it before it touched the children. That work was never named. It appeared in no list of household duties, but it was performed every day, carefully and without acknowledgement, by the woman at the centre of the home. You learned to read the house the way a sailor reads weather. The particular quality of quiet coming from the children's room that meant something was wrong between them and would need addressing before it became a fight. The set of your husband's shoulders when he came through the door that told you before he said a word whether the day had gone well or badly and therefore what kind of evening this would be. The slight tremor in your youngest voice at breakfast that meant something at school was worrying her, something she had not found the words for yet and would need you to draw out gently at the right moment without making her feel ambushed by your attention. You adjusted the evening accordingly. You moved the conversation at dinner away from the topics that might strike the wrong note on a night when tensions were already close to the surface. You found reasons to keep the children occupied in another room when a harder conversation needed to happen at the kitchen table. You knew when to let silence sit and when to fill it, and the difference between those two judgments was the kind of knowledge that came only from years of paying careful attention to the people in your care. When the children were frightened, you were calm, not because you were not also frightened, but because a frightened mother made a frightened house, and a frightened house did not help anyone. When your husband was discouraged, you listened without fixing, because fixing was not always what was needed, and you had learned the difference. When the children fought, you separated them and came back to each one separately, addressing the private version of the conflict rather than the public one, because the public version was rarely where the real difficulty lived. None of this appeared on any list. It generated no visible output. When it worked, which it usually did, its success was invisible, because the measure of it was the absence of the things it prevented. The evening that did not escalate, the worry that did not become a crisis, the small unhappiness that was noticed and tended before it grew into something larger. You were not thanked for it. You did not expect to be. The work was its own reward in the way that all work is its own reward when you are good at it and you know it, and the thing you are maintaining is worth maintaining. The family ran smoothly because you kept it running. That was the whole of it, and it was not a small thing. When you were unwell in a 1950s household, the house did not pause. Breakfast still needed to be made. Children still needed to be dressed and sent to school. Laundry did not wait because you had a fever. You moved more slowly, perhaps. You sat down when you could. But the idea of calling in sick, of the household simply running itself for a day while you rested, was not a reality most women lived inside. The work was continuous, and so you continued. You knew the particular arithmetic of a sick day that was not allowed to be a sick day. You triaged. The breakfast would be simpler this morning, toast and soft-boiled eggs, rather than the full production, because standing at the stove for an hour was not something your body was prepared to negotiate right now. The children would wear what was already clean in their drawers, even if it was not the outfit you would have chosen. The deep cleaning scheduled for Wednesday would move to Thursday, or the week after, or whenever your body returned to something that resembled normal. You moved through the house more carefully, one hand occasionally on the wall, pausing in doorways to let a wave of dizziness pass. The children watched you with that particular animal alertness children have around an unwell parent, aware that something in the household's foundation has shifted, uncertain how to account for it. You reassured them without making a production of the reassurance. Requesting assistance for the ordinary felt like an admission that the ordinary was beyond you, and you were not prepared to make that admission to anyone, least of all yourself. By afternoon you had usually found a way to sit. The children were at school, and the morning's tasks were done at whatever pace your body had permitted, and the house was quiet, and you made a cup of tea and sat in your chair and allowed yourself for 20 minutes to simply be unwell without apologizing for it or pushing through it or converting it into productivity. 20 minutes, then back up. Because the dinner still needed making, and the children would be home by 3, and the household did not hold its breath for anyone, not even the person holding it together, there was a particular expectation built into the role that the work should not show. The house should look clean, but not like cleaning had been the entire day. The dinner should arrive at the table as though it had assembled itself. The children should be well behaved and well dressed without appearing to have been wrangled into either. And you, at the centre of all of it, should look composed, pleasant, unhurried. The labour was supposed to be invisible, and a woman who allowed the effort to surface was quietly thought to be doing something wrong. The magazines made this expectation concrete and visual. The women in the photographs were always smiling, their aprons were always clean, their hair was always set. The kitchen behind them was always gleaming, the countertops clear, the surfaces polished, the window above the sink letting in the kind of warm light that suggested the whole room had been arranged by someone who understood photography and possibly God. These images were not presented as fantasy. They were presented as attainable, as the standard toward which a well-organized woman naturally arrived if she applied herself properly. You applied yourself. You got up early enough to have the kitchen in order before anyone else came downstairs. You changed out of your house coat and into your day dress and put on your lipstick before your husband left for work, because a wife who was still in her house coat at 7:30 was a wife who had not quite gotten her household together, and you were not that wife. You made the distinction between the actual state of the house and the presented state of the house, maintaining the latter as a kind of ongoing performance whose audience was your husband, your neighbours, your in-laws when they visited, and the version of yourself that lived up to the standard you had quietly internalised somewhere along the way. The effort this required was considerable, and it was layered on top of the actual work rather than replacing any of it. You did not choose between doing the work and making the work look effortless. You did both, because the era required both, and because there was a part of you that took genuine pride in it, in the house that looked beautiful, and the dinner that was hot, and the children who were clean, and the life that appeared, from any angle, to be running exactly as it should. The cost of it was carried privately. In the evenings when your feet ached, and you sat in your chair with your mending and you were too tired to read but too wound up to sleep. In the small, sharp moments of impatience you swallowed before they reached the surface. In the dreams, sometimes, of a morning that asked less of you, but the surface held. The house looked the way it was supposed to look. The dinner arrived at the table the way it was supposed to arrive, and the woman at the centre of it smiled, composed and unhurried, and no one thought to ask what it had cost. By the late 1950s, more women were working outside the home, and for those who did, the domestic expectations did not diminish. By the late 1950s, more women were working outside the home, and for those who did, the domestic expectations did not diminish. You left the house for your shift and returned to a second one. Dinner still needed to be made. The laundry was still yours. The children were still your primary responsibility. The word for this particular arrangement would not be named for several decades, but the reality of it lived in the tired evenings of women who had spent their days in two entirely different kinds of work, and were expected to make both look easy. You left the house in the morning with your hair done, and your uniform or your office dress pressed, and your mind already running two lists at once, one for the day's work and one for the evenings. You had started the dinner before you left, something in the slow oven that would be ready when you got home, or a soup that needed only reheating, or a casserole assembled the night before that wanted only an hour of heat. You had laid out what the children would need after school. You had arranged with the neighbour or the older child to watch the younger ones until you got back. At work you were competent and present, and you did your job with the same attention you gave everything else. The work was often its own satisfaction, a different kind of competence than the domestic kind, a conversation with the world outside the house that the house itself could not provide. The paycheck was a practical thing, but it was also something else, a small token of a different kind of value, a confirmation that the skills you applied mattered in a register the household never formally acknowledged. Then you came home. The children needed dinner, and the dinner needed finishing, and the table needed setting, and somewhere in the margin of that there were lunches to make for tomorrow, and a load of laundry that had been sitting in the washer since this morning, and needed to go into the dryer before it soured. You moved through the evening with the same efficiency you had applied to the day, faster now, sharper with fatigue, making decisions in the kitchen the way you made decisions at work, quickly and without second-guessing yourself, because second-guessing took time you did not have. Your husband came home to a house that was running, the children were fed, the dinner was on the table. The house did not look like someone had been away from it all day, which was exactly the point and exactly the problem. Because if the house did not look like it had been unattended, then no one had occasion to notice that it had been managed anyway, by you, in the margins of everything else, at a cost that did not appear on any balance sheet. You sat down to dinner at the end of that evening, and the day was not quite over yet. It was never quite over yet. Nobody sat a 1950s housewife down and explained how to run a household. You learned by watching your mother, by asking a neighbour, by failing at something and quietly figuring out what had gone wrong. You learned how to get a grease stain out of cotton before it set. You learned how long to boil a chicken before it fell from the bone. You learned which vegetables survived a hot car and which ones did not. You carried in your head a kind of working knowledge of domestic life so vast and so practical that it had no name, only application. Some of it came from your mother's kitchen, absorbed before you were old enough to know you were absorbing it. You were 7 when you first stood beside her at the stove, not helping exactly, just watching. The way children watch things that seem important without being able to say why. You watched the way she tilted the pan to move the fat around before the onions went in. You watched the way she pressed her thumb into a pie crust to test its thickness without measuring it. You watched the way she smelled a cut of meat at the butcher counter and knew from that alone whether it was worth buying. None of it was explained. It was simply done, and you were present for the doing, and the doing went into you the way all the best learning does, quietly and completely without ceremony. Then there were the things you learned by getting them wrong. The first time you made gravy it was lumpy and you poured it out and started again. And the second time it was thin and you thickened it with a little more flour, and learned in that one afternoon what no recipe had managed to convey. That gravy is a conversation, not a formula. And the only way to learn it is to make it badly enough times to understand what you are actually after. The cake that fell in the middle taught you about oven temperature. The bread that would not rise taught you about yeast and patience, and the importance of warm water that was warm rather than hot. The shirt you scorched taught you that different fabrics require different heat, and that the iron is always more certain about this than you are. You knew things about the house itself that would not have occurred to anyone else to know. You knew that the second bedroom window swelled in humidity and needed to be opened from the top rather than the bottom in August, or it would stick closed entirely. You knew that the furnace filter needed changing every few months, and that the sound it made when it needed changing was slightly different from its ordinary sound, lower and more laboured. You knew which floorboard creaked, and at what hour of the night the creak would wake a sleeping child, and therefore which path to take from the bedroom to the kitchen if someone needed a glass of water at 2 a.m. You knew your children's bodies the way a doctor knows a patient file, except that your knowledge was warmer and more specific and more continuously updated. You knew the particular flush that meant your son's fever was climbing, versus the flush that meant he had simply been running in the yard. You knew your daughter's cough well enough to distinguish the one that needed watching from the one that was just the tail end of a cold working its way out. You knew which child needed to be held when they were upset, and which one needed space and a quiet return to normalcy, and you knew that getting this backwards made things considerably worse. You knew how to make a meal out of very little, and how to make very little look like enough, and how to set a table so that whatever was on it appeared chosen rather than improvised. You knew how to get a child to take medicine without a battle, how to remove a splinter with a needle and a steady hand and a calm voice, how to get candle wax off a tablecloth and ink off a shirt collar and crayon off a painted wall. This knowledge had no credential attached to it. It generated no salary and no formal recognition. It lived entirely in the doing, passed from mother to daughter across generations in the unremarkable vocabulary of ordinary days, and its value was most apparent only in its absence, in the household where these things were not known, where small problems became larger ones for want of the particular competence that prevented them. You did not think of it as expertise, you thought of it as knowing how to manage, which was simply what women did, and which was, quietly and without anyone making a particular point of it, one of the most practically intelligent things a person could know how to do. By evening, the visible work was mostly done. The kitchen was clean, the children were in bed, the house had returned to something resembling order. But the day did not actually end. You mended something while sitting beside your husband. You made a list for tomorrow. You thought about what needed to be done before the weekend. You noticed that one of the children had been quiet at dinner, and you turned that over in your mind. The day closed the way it had opened, with work that was too small to name but too constant to stop. The living room in the evening had its own atmosphere, different from the day's. The lamps were on, and the overhead light was off, and the room was warmer and more contained. The windows gone dark against the night outside. Your husband was in his chair. The radio or the television was on at low volume. The children's sounds had faded from the upstairs, that particular shift from the rustling and whispering of children not quite asleep to the full, settled quiet that meant they were gone for the night, and the house had contracted around the two of you in the way houses do when the day releases them. You sat with your mending or your sewing, and your hands moved through the familiar motions while part of your mind drifted across the surface of tomorrow. You were composing the grocery list without quite calling it that, running through what was low in the pantry, what the week's meals would require, what needed to be picked up Thursday. You were reviewing the children's schedules, the school event on Friday that required bringing something, the dentist appointment that needed rescheduling, the permission slip that was due and that you needed to remember to sign before the morning rush carried it out of your mind entirely. None of this looked like work from the outside. From the outside it looked like sitting quietly in the lamplight, which was a perfectly accurate description of the surface of it. What it did not describe was the layer of quiet management running underneath, the continuous low-frequency attention that was the real architecture of the household, the thing that kept all the pieces from drifting out of alignment. Your husband talked about his day, and you listened in the way you had learned to listen, fully present and genuinely interested but also capable, simultaneously, of tracking the other thread. You made the responses that were called for and asked the questions that kept the conversation moving forward, and you were not performing attention, you were simply attending to more than one thing at once, which was a skill you had developed so thoroughly it no longer felt like a skill, it felt like breathing. The list was never finished because it was never meant to be finished. It was a living document that grew as the week advanced and shrank as the tasks were completed, and grew again as new things required attention, and it existed nowhere but in your own mind, which meant it was never put down, never switched off, never left on the counter while you stepped outside for a moment of air that was entirely your own. By 10 o'clock the mending was done or put away until tomorrow. The list was as complete as the evening would allow. Your husband's coffee cup was rinsed and turned upside down in the dish rack. The back door was checked, the lights were turned off room by room, and you moved through the house in the final accounting of the day, making sure everything was as it should be, before you allowed the house to hold itself for the few hours of the night. You climbed the stairs with the particular fatigue of a person who has been useful all day in the quiet, uncelebrated way that most of life's necessary work gets done. The house was still, the children were sleeping. Tomorrow the alarm would ring before anyone else was ready for it, and you would already be up. Saturday had a different texture than the weekdays, but it was not rest. It was the morning when the floors got scrubbed on hands and knees rather than swept. It was when the refrigerator was emptied and wiped clean. It was when the children were home and underfoot and needed directing towards something useful while you worked around them. Saturday had a productive, almost cheerful energy to it. The satisfaction of tasks that had accumulated through the week finally being addressed. And if the work finished early, the afternoon might even hold something that looked a little like leisure. The morning started with the refrigerator because the refrigerator was the thing you'd been meaning to address since Wednesday and had not gotten to, and an unaddressed refrigerator had a way of making itself known. You pulled everything out onto the counter and wiped the shelves with a cloth wrung out in warm water, reaching into the corners where condensation collected, checking the condition of what came out, setting aside anything that had gone past reorganizing what remained so that the things most likely to be needed were at the front where they could be found without excavating the back. The children helped with Saturday in the way children help, which is to say they helped with the parts that were interesting and disappeared when the parts that were not interesting arrived. Your son could be counted on to sweep the back porch if you handed him the broom and pointed him in the right direction. Your daughter liked polishing the silver, which was not a task that needed doing every week, but which kept her occupied and produced a visible result she could point to with satisfaction. You gave them the tasks most likely to hold their attention and absorbed the remainder yourself, which was most of it. But the company was worth something, even when the help was more nominal than actual. The floors came last because floors showed everything, and there was no point doing them before the dusting and the wiping and the moving of furniture that preceded them. You swept first, pushing the dust toward the centre of each room and then gathering it up, then went over the hardwood on your hands and knees with a cloth and a bucket of soapy water, working section by section from the far wall toward the door, the way your mother had shown you, so you did not scrub yourself into a corner. The linoleum in the kitchen got the same treatment, and when it dried, it had a particular clean smell and a faint shine that was one of the week's small, reliable satisfactions. By noon, the house had the feeling of a place that had been properly attended to, not just maintained but addressed, its accumulated week of living washed away and reset to something close to its best self. You stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the clean floor and the wiped counters and the refrigerator running quietly with its ordered contents, and you allowed yourself a moment with that feeling before the afternoon arrived with its own requirements. If the afternoon was kind, the children went outside and the house stayed in the order you had made of it for a few quiet hours, and you sat with a cup of coffee and the newspaper your husband had left on the table, reading the parts that interested you in the particular unhurried way that was only possible when the work was genuinely done and not merely deferred. Those Saturday afternoons, still and orderly and briefly your own, were some of the best hours of the week. You did not take them for granted. She did not complain about the work, at least not in any way that invited a serious response. The culture around her offered no language for it. The work was simply what women did, and to name it as exhausting or unrewarding or repetitive was to sound ungrateful for a life that looked, from the outside, perfectly comfortable. And so she carried the weight of it privately in the small, sharp moments between tasks, and she found her satisfactions where she could, in a well-turned pie crust, in a table set just right, in the quiet knowledge that the home was running because she was keeping it running. There were things you said to the neighbour over the back fence that came close to it, wrapped in humour the way difficult truths often are. A laugh about the ironing pile that was really about the ironing pile and everything it represented. A rueful comment about the morning that was really about all the mornings and what they added up to. The neighbour laughed with you, and you laughed back, and the conversation moved on, and the thing that was almost said dissolved back into the ordinary afternoon, which was where it lived most of the time. Present but unnamed, understood between women without requiring the exposure of being spoken plainly. You did not say it to your husband because there was no framework for the conversation. He worked hard, and he knew he worked hard, and the comparison that would have to be made to say what needed saying was a comparison that felt too large and too uncertain, and too likely to go wrong to risk on a weeknight after dinner. And besides, what would be asked of him if you did say it? The children still needed raising, the house still needed running, the meals still needed making. The saying of it would change the facts of it not at all, and so the saying of it stayed in the place where unspoken things live, somewhere between your chest and your throat, familiar enough that you had mostly stopped noticing it was there. What you said instead were the small, manageable truths, that you were tired today, that the week had been a full one. These were acceptable. These fit inside the available language. They did not ask for anything that could not be given, a sympathetic nod, an offer to help with the dishes, a quiet evening without additional demands. You had calibrated your expression of difficulty to the size of response the world around you was capable of providing, and the calibration had become so automatic you had almost forgotten you were doing it. The satisfactions were real. That needs saying plainly, because it is true. The bread that rose correctly was genuinely satisfying. The child who came home from school having mastered something she'd been struggling with produced a warmth in you that was as uncomplicated as anything you felt. The house on a Saturday afternoon, clean and ordered and briefly still, gave you something that was real and yours and not nothing. You were not unhappy. Exactly. The life was full and it was meaningful, and there were hours in it that belonged to you in ways you valued. But there was also the weight of what was never acknowledged, the endless unrecorded labour, the competence that was assumed rather than recognised, the self that existed before and beneath and alongside the role, patient and quiet, waiting for a world that had not yet found its way to the right questions. You kept going, you kept the house, you found your satisfactions in the margins, and you never quite said out loud what the margins cost. Years from now, the things she made and kept and tended will appear in antique shops and on the shelves of people who never knew her name. A quilt she pieced from scraps on winter evenings, a recipe card in her handwriting, folded small and tucked into a cookbook, a tablecloth she embroidered herself the summer before she was married. She did not think of these things as a legacy. She thought of them as Tuesday. But they have lasted, and they carry something of her still, a particular kind of care and attention and quiet endurance that the modern world has largely found a way around, and sometimes, in honest moments, misses. The recipe card is the one that stops people. You find it tucked between pages, written in the careful hand of a woman who learned penmanship in an era that took penmanship seriously. The letters even and unhurried, the measurements given with the particular confidence of someone who had made this dish enough times to know what it needed without second-guessing herself. The ingredients are simple. The instructions are brief in the way of a person writing for themselves rather than for a stranger, a note that assumes you already know certain things, that you know what it means when it says, until it looks right. because anyone who had spent enough time in a kitchen would know, and in that era most people had. The quilt takes longer to understand. You have to look at it to see what it is made of, remnants of dresses and shirts and curtains that no longer exist in any other form, arranged in a pattern that was not random, that was thought about and decided upon on some winter evening with the fabric spread out on the kitchen floor, the colours moved around until the arrangement satisfied something in the eye that had no name but was immediately recognisable when it was achieved. The quilt is warm, and it is beautiful in the particular way that functional things become beautiful when they are made with more care than the function strictly required. The embroidered tablecloth comes out at holidays in families that still have one. It has been washed so many times the linen has softened to something close to silk, and the embroidery, worked in the long patient hours of an earlier life, has faded slightly at the edges of each motif. The colours quieter now than they were, but still there, still legible, still carrying the exact pressure of the needle and the exact choice of thread made by a woman whose hands knew what they were doing. These objects are not monuments. They were never intended to outlast the life that made them. They were made for Tuesday, for the Sunday table, for the winter that needed something to do with its long evenings. That they lasted is a kind of accident, though the care that went into them is the reason for the accident, because things made with real attention have a way of surviving the inattention of everything that comes after. The people who find them in the antique shops and the estate sales often cannot say exactly why they want them. There is something in the handwriting, in the stitching, in the worn softness of the linen that communicates across the distance of decades a quality of life that is harder to locate now, not easier, not simpler, but more present to itself, more attentive to the texture of ordinary days, more willing to spend time on the things that would be used and used again until they wore out or were handed down. She did not know she was leaving any of this behind. She was just getting through the week. But the week she left behind was full of things made carefully, and carefully made things have a long life, and somewhere tonight, in a warm kitchen that owes more to her than it knows, something she touched is still doing exactly what she made it to do. The street was not just a place where houses happened to sit beside one another. It was a living thing, a network of small obligations and quiet understandings that held the community together in ways nobody organised and nobody needed to organise because they had grown up out of proximity and necessity and the simple human fact that people who live near one another tend, over time, to become part of each other's days. You knew your neighbours the way you knew the rooms of your own house, not perfectly, not without occasional friction, but thoroughly, and with the kind of familiarity that made certain things possible that could not have existed otherwise. The borrowing was a language all its own. A cup of sugar requested at the back door meant something slightly different from a cup of sugar. It meant I am here and you are here, and we are close enough that the small gaps in one household can be filled from another without ceremony. You kept track, not in a ledger, not formally, but in the way people keep track of things that matter, with a general sense of the balance and a quiet intention to maintain it. If you borrowed the egg on Tuesday, you brought over a slice of the cake it went into on Wednesday, because that was how it worked, and everyone understood how it worked without it ever being said. The children moved between yards with a freedom that seems, from this distance, almost impossible to imagine. They appeared at each other's back doors in the morning and were absorbed into whatever household they had arrived at, fed if it was mealtime, sent home if they were needed somewhere else, known by every adult on the block by name and by family, and by the particular quality of trouble each one was most likely to get into. You watched the neighbour's children with the same quiet authority you watched your own, and she watched yours, and this arrangement was not discussed or formalised because it did not need to be. It was simply how the street worked, and the street had been working that way long enough that no one thought to call it remarkable. The fence conversations happened in the afternoon, that particular window between the morning's work and the evening's preparations, when the day loosened slightly and the yard was a place you might stand for a few minutes without it feeling like a detour from something more important. You leaned on the fence and she leaned on hers, and the conversation covered whatever it covered, the week's small events, the children, a recipe that had worked or had not, the news that someone on the street was expecting or unwell or moving away. These conversations were not important in the way that planned conversations are important. They were important in the way that water is important, so continuous and so ordinary that their absence would have been a kind of drought. There was a texture to knowing your neighbours well that went beyond the practical. You knew which family had a difficult winter and which one had just gotten good news. You knew whose marriage was under strain and whose children were thriving and whose were not, and you held this knowledge with the discretion that was its own form of respect, not gossiping carelessly with it, but using it to inform the kind of attention you paid, to know when to bring something over, when to offer a hand, when simply to acknowledge that you had seen and that seeing was enough. When something went wrong, the street knew before anyone had to be told. A casserole appeared at the door. Someone offered to take the children for the afternoon without being asked. The neighbour, who happened to be walking past, slowed down and asked genuinely how things were going, and waited for the real answer rather than the polite one. This support was practical and unsentimental and immediate, the kind that did not require the person receiving it to explain their need or express their gratitude in any elaborate way, because the giving of it was understood to be what neighbours did. The same way breathing was understood to be what people did, as natural and as unremarkable as that. You were part of all of this, and it was part of you, this intricate, unwritten social fabric that asked something of you every day, and gave something back in equal measure. There were mornings when the fence conversation was the only adult exchange the day provided, and it was enough, not because it solved anything or went anywhere in particular, but because the simple fact of being known by the person on the other side of the fence, known by name and by household and by the small history of borrowed eggs and shared recipes, and children grown up alongside each other, was a form of belonging that the modern world has found increasingly difficult to replicate. The neighbourhood was not a backdrop to the life. It was a condition of it, woven into the daily rhythm as completely as the schedule itself, sustaining the household from the outside the way the household sustained the family from within. When families began to move, as they did in the later years of the decade, out to newer developments farther from the city, something went with them that was harder to rebuild than a house. The physical structure could be replicated. The fence conversation, the borrowed cup of sugar, the neighbour who knew without being told when something was wrong, these took years to grow and could not be packed into a moving box. You maintained your place in it with the same quiet attention you brought to everything else that kept the household and the street and the small world between the two running as it should. It was, in its way, one of the most important things you did. The radio was on for most of the day, not always listened to, not always attended to with full concentration, but present in the way that certain necessary things are present, background and foreground at once, company that did not demand anything back. It sat on the kitchen counter or on the shelf in the living room, and it ran from the morning news through the soap operas through the afternoon music programs and into the evening variety shows, and the house organised itself loosely around its schedule, the way it organised itself around everything else, with a familiarity that made the structure feel natural rather than imposed. In the morning it was the news, and you listened with one part of your attention while the other part managed the breakfast. The voice of the announcer was a known quantity, measured and authoritative, reading out the events of a world that felt, from the kitchen, both very near and very far away. You knew about Korea and the bomb, and the particular anxiety that ran underneath the decade's cheerful surface, and the radio brought you that knowledge daily in the same tone it brought you the weather forecast and the farm report, all of it delivered in the same even cadence that somehow made the enormous and the ordinary feel like they belonged in the same morning, which perhaps they did. The soap operas came on mid-morning, and this was when the radio became something closer to company. The stories were improbable, and the characters made decisions that no sensible person would make, and the drama escalated at a pace designed to keep you returning tomorrow and the day after that, and you listened while you ironed or folded or moved through the kitchen's requirements for the afternoon, and the voices in the room made the work feel less solitary. The characters had names you knew as well as your neighbours' names, and their troubles, while more theatrical than anything on your street, were recognisable in their emotional architecture, the jealousy and the misunderstanding and the love that expressed itself badly, and the hope that kept reasserting itself despite everything. You did not discuss the soap operas at length with your husband. They were yours, a small private pleasure belonging to the hours of the day that were yours alone, and you guarded them with the light, cheerful possessiveness of someone who does not have many things that belong only to them. The music programs in the afternoon had a different quality altogether, something instrumental and unhurried that moved through the house like weather, filling the rooms without insisting on attention, softening the edges of a long day without demanding that you stop and notice it. There were afternoons when a particular song came on, and you paused in whatever you were doing and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the dish towel in your hand, not thinking anything in particular, just present to the music and the afternoon light and the smell of whatever was working quietly on the stove. Those moments cost nothing and were worth considerably more than they seemed. Small pauses in the current of the day where the day asked nothing of you for 30 seconds, and you gave it nothing back, and the exchange felt, briefly, like balance. The evening programs were the family's, not yours alone. The children gathered for their shows before bed, specific programs at specific times that structured the final hours as reliably as the morning schedule structured the first ones. Your husband had his programs, the news again, a comedy on certain nights, a drama that he followed with the quiet investment of someone who did not admit to being invested. The radio gave the evening its shape, and when it was finally switched off, the silence that followed had a particular completeness to it, the sound of a day that had said everything it needed to say and was now prepared to let itself be over. What the radio provided underneath all of it was the sense of being part of something larger than the house. The same programs were playing in the houses up and down the street, in houses across the city, across the country, and the knowledge of that, even unspoken, even unexamined, gave the daily life a connective tissue it might otherwise have lacked. You were alone in your kitchen, but the voice in the radio was speaking to everyone, and everyone was listening, and that shared listening was a form of company more expansive than the fence conversation, and more democratic than anything the decade had otherwise arranged. The house without the radio was a different house, and on the rare mornings when something went wrong with it, and the repairman had to be called, and the kitchen was silent through the morning's work, You noticed the absence the way you noticed a missing tooth, with a constant low awareness that something familiar was gone, and the shape of the day was different without it. It came back, and you switched it on, and the kitchen was itself again. You did not stay in your housecoat past 7:30. That was not a rule written anywhere, but it was understood with the clarity of a rule, understood the way many things in that era were understood, as a standard maintained not because anyone was watching, but because you were watching, and your own sense of how things should be done was the most exacting audience you had. By the time your husband left for work, you were dressed, your hair was done, your lipstick was on. The day had been met on its own terms rather than on the terms of someone who had not quite gotten herself together yet. This was not vanity, or not only vanity. It was a form of order, the outward expression of an inward standard that said the household is running, the person at the centre of it is composed, and whatever the day brings will be met by someone who is prepared for it. The getting dressed was the declaration of readiness, and readiness was the posture the day required. There was something in pulling on the house dress and fastening the buttons and checking the result in the mirror that completed the transition from the private self of the early morning to the version of yourself that the day and the household and whoever might knock on the door would encounter. The two versions were not dishonest with each other. They were simply different registers of the same person, one not yet fully assembled and one ready to proceed. The clothes themselves were chosen with care, not elaborate care, not the care of someone with infinite time and resources, but the practical care of a woman who understood that how she dressed communicated something about how she ran her household and how she moved through the world. You had your house dresses, cotton prints in cheerful colours that could survive a day of cooking and cleaning and child wrangling without looking entirely defeated by the experience, and you had your good dresses for church and for company and for the occasions that required a different register entirely. You knew which was which, and you made the distinction automatically, the way you made all the distinctions in this life, through long practice that had made the judgment second nature. The girdle was a daily reality, as ordinary and as unremarked upon as the shoes, accepted as part of what dressing meant in that era, without particular resentment and without particular enthusiasm. You put it on because the silhouette required it, and because you had been putting it on long enough that it had become background, one of the many small physical accommodations of the role that you made without registering them as accommodations anymore. The nylons were attached to the garters with the automatic efficiency of long habit, checked carefully for runs before you left any room where they might be observed, because a run in your nylons was the kind of small, visible failure the era noticed, and you had no interest in providing anyone with that particular observation. The lipstick was the final thing, and it was not negotiable. Red or coral or the soft pink that suited the daytime, applied in 2 passes and pressed together and checked in the mirror with the quick assessing glance of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and knew in an instant whether it was right. The lipstick was armour of a kind, or perhaps more accurately it was a signal, a visible indication that the morning had been attended to, that the woman in this house was operating at the standard the house required. You went through this ritual every morning with the understanding that the day would be easier if you were dressed for it than if you were not, and this understanding had proven itself correct enough times that it had long since stopped feeling like a theory and started feeling like a fact. A dressed woman moved through her household differently than an undressed one. She answered the door without apology. She received the neighbour at the back fence without embarrassment. She sat down to the task at hand without the low, background distraction of knowing she had not yet quite begun. The housecoat went back on the hook behind the bedroom door. The day was ready for you. More importantly, you were ready for it. Sunday morning had a gravity that the other mornings did not. It asked the household to organise itself differently, to present itself to the community in a way the weekdays never required, to dress and gather and move together towards something outside the house rather than deeper into it. The preparation began the night before, shoes polished and set by the door. The children's clothes laid out on the chair beside each bed. The car checked to make sure there was enough gas, because a Sunday morning that began with an empty tank was a Sunday morning that had already gone wrong before it had properly started, and Sunday mornings were not permitted to go wrong if it could be helped. The church was not simply a building you went to on Sundays. It was a structure in the social life of the neighbourhood, as substantial as any physical one. A place where the community assembled and recognised itself, where the loose network of the street and the block and the surrounding houses briefly became visible as a whole, each family in its pew, the week's absences noted and accounted for in the quiet accounting that congregations perform without discussing. You knew who was missing and what the missing likely meant, illness or travel, or the kind of private difficulty that would eventually surface in the back fence conversation, and you filed this information in the same place you filed everything that the neighbourhood required you to know. The service itself had a specific texture that was also a specific comfort. The same order every week, the same responses spoken in the same voices, the same hymns in their proper seasons, and this repetition was not something to be endured, but something to be inhabited, a known structure that asked nothing new of you, and gave back in return a particular kind of steadiness that the rest of the week did not always provide. You stood and sat and stood again, and your voice joined the other voices, and the joining was its own form of reassurance, a reminder that you were not running the household alone in the universe, but inside a community with shared words and shared beliefs, and a shared willingness to show up in the same place at the same time every week, and call that faithfulness. The children sat beside you with varying degrees of cooperation, depending on their age and their mood and the length of the sermon, and you managed this with the small, unobtrusive interventions of a woman who had learned that church with children was less a spiritual experience than a logistical one, a quiet negotiation conducted in whispers and meaningful looks, and the occasional firm hand on a restless knee. The older ones had learned to be still. The younger ones were learning. The learning took years and required patience that was its own form of devotion. Afterward, the conversation on the front steps was its own social occasion, unhurried and warm in the particular way of people who've just shared something and are not quite ready to disperse back into their separate lives. Plans were made here, quietly and without fuss. Support was offered here, in the form of a hand on an arm and a low-voiced question that communicated more than its words. The small logistics of mutual aid that sustained the street were often arranged in these 20 minutes between the service and the Sunday drive home, in the way that communities have always arranged such things, not through formal structures but through the accumulated attention of people who know each other well enough to notice when something is needed. Sunday dinner followed with the particular ceremony of a meal the week had been building toward. The roast had been going in the oven since before church, low and patient, and the house when you returned carried its smell through every room, that specific Sunday smell of slow-cooked meat and warm oven, and the particular contentment of a household that is about to sit down together. The good dishes came down, the tablecloth went on, the food was brought to the table, and the family gathered around it with a completeness the weeknight versions of this scene did not quite achieve, everyone present, Everyone accounted for, the week's pressures briefly and mercifully suspended. By Sunday evening, the coming week was already assembling itself in your mind. But for those hours between the church steps and the cleared Sunday table, the household had been inside something larger than itself, and it came home from that larger thing carrying a quality of steadiness that would last, if you were careful with it, through at least the first part of the week ahead. She was not only the work, that need saying plainly and without qualification, because it is the thing most easily lost in the accounting of everything she did and everything the era asked of her. Beneath the routine and the schedule and the particular competence she had developed across years of running a household, there was a person with a history and a private interior and a set of preferences and longings and small joys that belonged to her alone, and had nothing to do with how well the bread rose or whether the floors were clean. She had existed before the role found her, and she continued to exist inside it, quieter perhaps, less visible certainly, but present in every room of the life she was living, in ways the life itself did not always make room to acknowledge. She had been someone before she was a wife and a mother. She had had a favourite book and a strong opinion about music and a friendship with a woman from her school years that she still maintained through letters written at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, letters that were careful and warm and revealed more of her than the daily life did, because the woman she was writing to had known her before the role existed and did not require the edited version. Those letters were among the most honest things she produced in a week, and they were also among the most private, folded into envelopes and sent away and not discussed with anyone, a correspondence that belonged to the part of her that the household could not reach. She noticed beauty in the way that people notice beauty when they do not have much unstructured time to seek it out, which is to say she noticed it in passing, in the pauses between tasks, with a quickness that came from having learned to catch things on the move. The light on a Tuesday morning that came through the kitchen window at an angle that turned the steam from the percolator into something briefly luminous. The particular colour of the yard in October when the leaves had turned and the sky had shifted into that specific shade of blue that only October in the Midwest or the Northeast or wherever you were produces, a blue so clear and so particular that it felt less like weather and more like an argument for the existence of something larger than weather. The way a child looked when they were sleeping, the face returned to something unguarded and entirely itself, the daily negotiations of childhood suspended for the night, leaving only the original person underneath. She had opinions she did not always express, about the neighbours and the news and the way certain things were arranged in the world, and the way she sometimes thought they perhaps should be arranged differently. She had a sense of humour that surfaced most fully in the company of women she trusted, a wry and dry wit that belonged to the part of her that was watching all of this from a slight remove, the part that found the whole enterprise of modern domesticity quietly and persistently amusing without finding it contemptible, because contempt was not what she felt. What she felt was more complicated than contempt and more honest, something closer to the amused, clear-eyed affection of someone who has chosen a life and is living it fully, and is also capable of seeing it from the outside. She had dreams that belonged to the night and to the Sunday afternoon letter, and to the rare hour when the house was quiet enough to allow something besides management. Some of these dreams were practical, a trip she would like to take, a course she had seen advertised in the back of a magazine, a skill she had always meant to develop. Others were less definable, less about specific destinations and more about a quality of experience that the daily life did not quite provide, a sense of being known in her full complexity rather than in the useful, competent, reliable version the role required. She was tired, regularly and genuinely, in the way that people who do continuous necessary work become tired, not broken by it, but shaped by it in ways both visible and invisible, the tiredness living in the body as a kind of low, permanent companion that good sleep could reduce but never quite eliminate. And yet the tiredness coexisted with something that was also genuine, a satisfaction that ran alongside it like a parallel current, a knowledge that the life she was living was real in a way that mattered, that the people she was caring for were better for the caring, and that the household she maintained was a thing of actual value, even when it received no formal acknowledgement of that value from the world that benefited most directly from it. She was the woman beneath the role, and the role did not diminish her. She was both things at once, fully, without apology, in the way that people who live without the luxury of performing only one version of themselves become both things so thoroughly that the boundary between them dissolves. She carried it all through the long, ordinary days of a life the world called simple, and it was anything but. And so the day is done. The percolator has gone cold on the stove. The ironing board is folded and put away. The children are in bed, their faces soft in the dark, their shoes by the door for tomorrow. The house is quiet in the way it is only quiet after it's been fully lived in, not empty but settled, the way a room settles after the people in it have finally rested. We have walked through a life today that the world called ordinary, and it was ordinary in the truest and most honourable sense of that word. It was made of Mondays and Tuesdays and the particular smell of bread in a warm kitchen, and the sound of a screen door and the low hum of a radio filling a room where someone was working. It was made of care that never announced itself, and competence that was never fully counted, and a quiet endurance that asked for very little in return and gave almost everything it had. The women who lived these days did not think of themselves as remarkable. They were just getting on with it, the same way their mothers had gotten on with it, the same way they hoped their daughters would. They held households and streets and communities together with their hands and their attention and their willingness to show up every morning before anyone else was ready for the day to begin. So tonight, carry something small forward from them, a moment of genuine attention, a meal made with a little more care, a conversation held without hurry, the simple, radical act of being present to the life that is right in front of you. They did not have more time than we do. They simply decided that the ordinary was worth showing up for, and they were right. Sleep well.